Like there's a lot of, especially on eBay, there's a lot of electronic enhancers, performance modules. The performance module that comes to mind that I've seen from dozens of sellers on eBay is something that just goes in with your air temp sensor. So one of the input sensors is your intake air temperature, IAT sensor, and it's just a resistor. Now, the ECU has adaptive strategies in there and compensation tables. When you're drawing in really, really cold air, the ECU can advance the ignition timing for better performance. They're able to do this because their NOx threshold with colder air produces less NOx. If you're drawing in really hot air, your NOx level output is higher, so then they have to retard the ignition timing to combat NOx formation. Additionally, if you're drawing in hot air, then your chances of detonating and causing engine damage go up, so they'll retard the timing. So whatever the reasons, colder air, get more ignition timing advance. So these performance enhancers are nothing but a 3-cent resistor and a 25-cent plastic enclosure with about 8 cents worth of wire that they're charging, I've seen $129 for them. On older vehicles, they kind of do work. I mean, really old vehicles don't have the adaptive strategies that the newer ones do, and by showing colder air, the computer will advance the ignition time. The problem with that on anything made that most of us would be driving is that you do have adaptive strategies. When you turn that key to the on position, the computer's going to look at the air temp sensor value. It's going to look at the coolant temperature sensor value. If you have a cabin sensor for your HVAC system, it's going to look at the temperature there. It's going to look at the catalytic converter temperature. If you have anything temperature related, it's going to look at all of them, and it's going to compare them. And if there's a trend over time where you have one that's out of whack, the computer's going to calibrate that and bring it back in line. So on a newer vehicle, that resistor, that performance enhancer, may work the first time or two you take it out, but in short order, the computer's going to calibrate around it, and it no longer works anymore. And you just wasted, on the cheap side, $30, on the high side, over $100. There's also something called an E.F.I.E device. You don't hear a whole lot about it anymore because it's been figured out that it's not that effective on the newer vehicles. First, it only works on narrowband type oxygen sensors. And George Weissman developed this because he had his Hyzor electrolyzer and he had his Hyco, which is like a gasoline bubbler. And on the older carbureted stuff from the 70s and 80s, oh man, he was getting pretty consistent. 50% improvement in fuel economy. Easily. And then we got these computerized cars, and the computer was doing some weird, wacky compensation stuff, and you couldn't get the mileage out of them. And he figured out that it had something to do with the oxygen sensor, and if you just threw a little additional voltage into the signal, the computer would see a rich mixture and try to lean it back out again. And it worked great for quite a few years. But again, now we have adaptive strategies. If you always have, say, 100 millivolts always present on that O2 signal line, the computer's going to figure it out. First of all, when you turn the key on, the sensor shouldn't be working because it takes 660 degrees Fahrenheit before that sensor can actually do its job. So it's a high temp process. And if you got 100 millivolts there, where'd that come from? The computer calibrates around it. Second of all, if you're going down a steep hill or coming to a stop and you let off the throttle, the computer will turn the fuel injectors off. Now there's no fuel going into the engine. How can you have a rich mixture when there's no fuel going into the engine? And again, the computer calibrates around it. So the E.F.I.E is no longer effective, and it doesn't work on what we would consider a modern oxygen sensor, a wideband sensor, or like Toyota and Honda use what they call an A.F.R sensor. Then there's a map adjust. A map adjust was developed for, I think, by some guys that were stroking the Jeep engine, building up the 4-liter and bigger cubic inches, and they needed a way of just fine-tuning the fuel trim and ignition timing. And so what they did was, the map sensor is like a variable resistor, like a radio knob. You have what's called VREF at the top, 5 volts. You have ground at the bottom. And then your radio knob, your volume knob, is actually the engine vacuum. So higher engine vacuum produces lower output voltage. So when you first turn the key on and there is no vacuum, you got a high voltage. You fire up the engine and the output voltage goes low. High vacuum means less load. Less load means less fuel. So if you just took your VREF and dropped it down a little tiny bit, now it's going to proportionately drop down your signal. So the engine would always see less load, deliver less fuel. That can be effective depending on what you're doing. It is a Band-Aid over type of a device. It's based on the LM317 adjustable voltage regulator, anybody who knows anything about electronics. But as you decrease the fuel because of less load, you're also going to increase ignition timing advance, because you get more advance, less load. When you pounce on it, the computer retards the timing. And that may be exactly what you need for what you're doing. But if you're speeding up combustion, getting back to the window of opportunity there, if you're speeding up combustion and making things happen faster, advancing the timing is the last thing you want to do. If anything, you're going to be trying to retard it. So keep that in mind. There is something called the interjector. Now, this is where I have to come clean. That is the one thing that I talk about in this entire course that is my company's product. The interjector, or IXR for short, is a fairly simple electric. Would you mind if I showed the folks at home an interjector? Because that is one of our class handouts. All right, it's a very small device. It's got 2 leads on it, and it simply goes in parallel with the fuel injector. So you have 2 wires going to your fuel injector. One lead goes to one wire, the other lead goes to the other. You're not cutting your factory wiring at all. Literally, you could just take and put these leads right down along the wires into the fuel injector connector to where the bare leads on the IXR are in contact with the bare connectors on the ends of the wires that plug into your fuel injector. That would be good for temporary testing. For permanent install, of course, I would recommend you shave back some of the insulation on the wires, wrap that around once, solder it in place, and then, tape it off. But it's an extremely simple install. Now, what does it do? What it does is, we found that the fuel injector is an inductor. It's an inductive solenoid. And inductors have some incredibly unique properties that are unlike any of the other components that you would normally work with in electronics. And we found that we can enhance that inductive process and how it delivers the fuel. It is a tuning aid. And what we have found is if you have a stock engine, a stock vehicle, and you install an IXR, it doesn't really do anything. It is a compensator. If you install Polestar spark plugs, peaking caps, or you have like a tornado device in your air intake, free-flowing K&N drop-in filter, you're doing something that actually enhances combustion. You're improving combustion efficiency. Now you're going to see the gains. So IXRs with no other mods, you're probably not going to see anything. You may install a set of Polestar spark plugs or do a Gadget Man groove, and you don't really see anything. But when you add the IXRs to an effective modification, now you're getting those hard-earned gains. The IXRs allow you to get the well-earned legal modification gains that you do to your engine. There's other tuners out there as well. You can go, if you know what you're doing or you have access to a professional tuner, there's HP Tuner, there's Diablo. They involve a license with the OEM, but now you can go in and you can affect your air-fuel ratios, you can affect your timing tables, and you can literally tune. There's also like standalone ECUs and whatnot, like the Mega Squirt or Excel DFI, where you can go in and replace certain functions that your factory ECU was covering. That is probably not going to be legal for a street vehicle. The HP Tuner and Diablo, they're legal, but replacing certain functions of the factory ECU with an aftermarket is probably not going to be legal, just so you know, but it does work. And there's also like daughter cards, Unichip, for example, where it's effectively doing the same thing. But if you add an effective fuel economy enhancer, fuel efficiency enhancer, and you don't tune for it, you may even see worse fuel economy than you did before. So the IXRs works with most mild enhancers.